9:19 in the English. Good evening, gentlemen. We are in the middle of chapter 7 of the Tanya. We're actually in the middle of a discussion. We're in the middle of a topic that we just began discussing last week. The flow of our chapter so far is as follows. The flow of our chapter is as follows. The entire world, the separate aspect of the world, the aspect of the world which appears separate from God, is a result of his kingship. It's created from Malchus, his desire to rule, because it is this divine trait which requires the reality of something outside of Hashem, the reality of something outside of God. So the world, to the extent that it is outside of him, where does this outside of him aspect come from? It comes from his trait of kingship. It comes from his malchus. It is in his desire to be king that the world is created separate from him, inasmuch as it is separate from him at all. As we discussed in previous chapters, that this is only really an appearance from our end, which is a function of the tzimtzum, the contraction of the light, etc., etc. But to whatever extent that it is separate from him, it is only separate from him because of his malchus, his will to be king. This malchus, this will to be king, this will to rule over, which as we explained previously, the king rules over someone. Desire to be king is really unified with all of the other divine traits in one of two ways: either Yehuda Ilah with a higher level unity, or Yehuda Tata with a lower level unity. There we go. Okay, it's working again apparently. All right.
You should have got the whole class before you realized.
Yeah. All right. Where were we? The trait of God's kingship is united with all of his other traits in either a higher level unity or a lower level unity, which is just a different way of saying, right, without all of the details, which as we found out in our classes on this topic are quite complex and difficult. This is just another way of saying that his kingship is not separate from him at all. His kingship is like a ray of the sun in the sun. It itself has no importance or particular reality outside of God himself, just like his other traits. Despite the fact that this trait seems to necessitate the world needing to exist, this trait itself does not need to exist. This trait itself is not of any great importance. Either the universe, as we were defining the worlds by time and space, either time and space in Yehuda Ilah purely expresses what is above time and space, like the Aron in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where the space that the box took up expressed godliness beyond space, or it expresses as miracles within nature, which is what we experience most of the time. The Yehuda Tata, the fact that his kingship, that time and space, even though they appear to have their own reality, are really only an expression of what's above time and space. So it can appear to be just what's above time and space. It could appear to be time and space having a reality, but either way, it presents itself. What is it? It's nothing other than what is above time and space. It's nothing other than the infinite expression of the divine. There is no reality to the source of the world. A different way of putting this point is that before this chapter we said that the world is nothing but the divine speech. In this chapter we're saying that the mouth which produces the divine speech, Malchus, is really of no importance of itself. There really isn't a mouth either. There's just God and his infinite expression. So there's no speech. All the world is the divine speech, and all the divine speech is coming from the divine mouth is nothing. It is of no importance or independent reality from God whatsoever. Given that fact, being that his kingship is really of no importance, we came to the conclusion 2 weeks ago that Ani Havaya Loy Shanisi. Last week, that Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, I, God, have not changed, as we discussed last week, that the creation of the world changes absolutely nothing from God's perspective. So it's not just that the universe is not an independent reality, it is really nothing to him. There is no change in the creation of the universe, because all the universe is, and even the trait which creates the universe, is totally nullified within the reality of God, like a ray of the sun in the sun. So nothing really changes. We began to explain last week how this applies to the divine knowledge, to the divine das, that how is he not changed? In the creation of the universe, he knows nothing new. That's what hasn't changed. What he knew before is the same as what he knows now. We asked, how could this be possible? We said, it's not just that he exists outside of time, right? Because that's not really the issue here. It's true that he exists outside of time, and that past, present, and future are all equal to him. He knows them all at once, which is true. But that doesn't solve the problem, because the way he will know the world as it is being created is different than the way he knows it when it will be created, right? Because as we explained at the beginning of Tanya, at the beginning of this Sefer, how does he create the world? Not at a distance, with a distant act of creation. He creates everything that exists by speaking it specifically into existence. In other words, God knows not everything, as we put it last week. He doesn't know everything from the outside. He knows everything from the inside. Right? How does he know the wallet? He knows it because he is speaking it into existence at every moment. He is closer to the wallet than the wallet is to itself, in a way. Right? He is the source of it. He is constantly creating it with all of its specific characteristics. Right? So how can it be that his knowledge hasn't changed, right? As we said last week, even in a totally static universe in which only two objects existed, I forgot what our examples were, something funny from last week, but even in a totally unchanging universe in which nothing changed, there's no past, present, and future, right? All it is something which has two things which exist forever. These two things he would apparently know differently. He would know one in a different way than he knows the other, because he creates them each in their own way, each independently. Right? So how can we say that the creation of the universe hasn't changed his knowledge? It's not just a before it was created, after he was created issue. It's a multiplicity issue. He has a different knowledge of each individual creation. And in general, he has a different knowledge of the creation in general than he does of the non-creation that preceded it, so to speak, right? Allowing, again, to discuss this as if it's within time. Because once you add in that time as a creation, it becomes a whole other story. And we explained, why has his knowledge not changed? His knowledge hasn't changed. He doesn't know a frog, here's my examples from last week. He doesn't know a frog different than he knows a giraffe. He doesn't know them differently. Because what's the difference between the frog and the giraffe is they have different qualities. They have a different neshama, which dictates their nature, right? The frog jumps. The giraffe eats leaves from tall trees, and many other, possibly infinite differences between them, if you really got into it. Many, many differences between them. Yes? Then, where do those differences come from? They come from different divine words that God is constantly speaking. There's a name for the frog, and there's a name for the giraffe. There's a name for the species. There's also a name for the individual. Everything is spoken into existence according to its nature. So that's where the differences in their nature and their qualities come from. That's what makes the frog different than the giraffe, is the different words that are used to speak them into existence. Where do these differences in the words that speak them into existence come from? They come from Malchus, as we described earlier, the Hemoitzah Sapeh, the 5 parts of the mouth that produce letters. They come from the mouth. What's the mouth? The mouth is Malchus, the same divine trait we've been talking about the whole chapter. It's his kingship which produces these, it relates to these two different things differently. Right? For obvious reasons, because he wants to be king over this one thing in a specific way, or he speaks a different word. He wants to be king over this other thing in its own way. He speaks a different word into existence. But if these words, if the frog and the giraffe are nothing other than the divine speech, which is constantly speaking them into existence, and if the divine speech is an expression of his malchus, of the divine mouth, of the divine kingship. And if the divine kingship is nothing other than a ray of the sun in the sun, it itself is of no importance or independent reality, then what is really the difference between the frog and the giraffe? The difference is, there is no difference. There is no difference between the frog and the giraffe. Just as there is no difference between before time and space and after time and space. That's the most generalized case, right? If you take it to the most general level, when you're not talking about two specific creations, but the idea of creation in general, right? The idea of creation itself, you have a reality of time and space, and you have what precedes time and space. And what's the difference between them? The difference is nothing. There is no difference. There is no difference between them. Therefore, the creation of the universe adds nothing to his knowledge. That's what we learned and discussed last week. May I have a clock, please, or a watch or something? Here we go. Thank you. That's what we concluded last week. We concluded last week that there is no difference in his knowledge from before the world is created to when the world is created. We are going to continue on this idea this week. And we're going to bring the Rambam into it. We're going to discuss a famous phrase of the Rambam that we've discussed before in this class a long time ago, and we're going to get into it again from in a whole new angle, in a whole new way. So let's start on page 919 in the English, Ukamei Shekasav HaRambam in the Hebrew. Ukamei Shekasav HaRambam Zal in the Hebrew. All right, top of page 919. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, just as the Rambam of blessed memory wrote, Shahu HaYichud v'hu HaYidua v'hu HaDeya Atzma. The Rambam writes in Mishnah Torah. He writes it in his halachic work, which is very important because you can say anything relatively in a philosophical work, like the Guide for the Perplexed. But the Rambam doesn't write this as philosophy. The Rambam writes this as the nature of God and the object of Jewish belief in his law sefer. In other words, this is what Jewish law says about knowing God. What does it say? It says that what's the nature of God, so to speak? It's not really a nature, but what does it say? It says, he is the knower, which is the yodea. I'm going to use the English words more, because the Hebrew words, if you're not fluent in Hebrew, will be very confusing, because they all sound alike. So you have the knower, the yodea. You have the yadua. The yadua is what is known, the object of knowledge. And you have hadeya. The deya is the faculty of knowledge, which allows the knower to know the known. Again, you have three things. You have the knower. This is the individual with a mind. You have the known. That's what the mind thinks about. And you have the faculty of knowledge itself, the mind itself, right? In a person, you have the individual, the person themselves, you have their mind, and you have the thing that their mind understands. We're on page 919 in the English. You have the person, their mind, and the thing that their mind understands. In God, says the Rambam, Hakol Echad. All three of these things are one. And the Rambam continues and says very famously, "V'davar zeh ein keach bepel amrei." This matter, the mouth does not have the capacity to speak it. V'loi be'ezen l'shamai, and the ear does not have the ability to hear it. V'loi b'leiv ha'adam la'kira al-buya, and the mind of a human being does not have the ability to recognize it clearly. In other words, this idea, this concept the Rambam is discussing is beyond human understanding. The idea that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all as one. So to preface, and this will take us back to our Hamanis Alakus days when we were studying our previous Maimer, because we spoke about this at length a couple of classes in the previous discourse. Right? There's a very famous issue in general, a general theological issue with God, because God, the one God, right, as opposed to idols or pagan deities, or all the things that preceded Lahavdil, Avram, who the reinventor, the rediscoverer of monotheism, really the creator of monotheism, because it's a long story, but Avram in the Jewish tradition was really the first to have a original theology of his own. Everybody before him that knew God face to face, right? A way of revelation. The whole chidush, the whole innovation of Avram, the first Jew, is that he wasn't raised with the knowledge of God. He discovered God on his own. That was his whole claim to fame originally. Right? If you study the midrashim that explain who Avram was before we meet him in the Torah in Parshas Lech Lecha. Well, that's a footnote for the biblically minded. The difference between God and pagan deities, idols, other things, is that God is the creator of everything. And he is an unchanged creator. God is by definition infinite and unchanging and utterly simple. And really, if you learn the reasons why we must conclude these things philosophically, you'll realize that it's really three different names for the same thing. That he is infinite, unchanging. What was the third thing I said? Anyway, he is infinite, unchanging, and simple. That was the third thing. He is infinite, unchanging, and simple. Simple, not complex. The opposite of simple is the opposite of complex. Not made up of many parts. Right? These three things are really saying the same thing, theologically speaking. Then, therefore, due to that, since God is infinite and simple and unchanging, we have a question about God's knowledge. Because as we know in Judaism, God knows everything, right? Hakol gali v'yadua lefanav. Everything is revealed and known before him. And yet, we have a limited, changing universe. We have a universe both of limited creation and also a universe that is dynamic, a universe in which things are changing. Therefore, if the cup is here right this second, and I move it here, God knows the cup at every moment. Does this not imply a change in God's knowledge? This is the question at the simplest level. This question actually goes much deeper, and maybe as we learn a little bit more tonight, we'll see that really this issue is much more complex than that. But that's the basic issue. The basic issue is that God's knowledge, if God is truly all-knowing and perfect and infinite, it should be that his knowledge doesn't change. That's the first issue. The second issue, that's an issue with God's knowledge. I'll categorize these for you. That's an issue with God's knowledge and knowing the world in general. Then there's a second issue, which is, how does God know his knowledge? Or to put it differently, what is the relationship of God's knowledge to God? Because you basically have three options. You have three options. We discussed this in the previous mimer, if anyone remembers. We have discussed this before in this class. Maybe it will jog some memories. You have basically three options. You have God's knowledge could be a creation, right? In other words, you could imagine it's more like a science fiction story, but you could say God has servers, right, that he keeps. He keeps his knowledge in a library, right, or anything, or something like that, a huge intergalactic data center where God keeps all of his knowledge, right? His knowledge, because you understand that this would solve our previous issues. You could say his knowledge changes, and it's not an issue because it's just bits in the data center that change. It's not God who changes, right? But the issue with this should become immediately obvious, because the question always then becomes, so how does God know his knowledge? What is his relationship to this thing? What is the idea that knowledge is something, that his knowledge is totally separate from him? How could you even say he really knows through something that is totally separate from him? It's almost incoherent, right? How can I know the cup using a tool which is totally unconnected to me? It is a totally separate reality, a computer. It's not me, right? So how can I use a computer to know, right? We seem to be creating either an issue where God doesn't know his own knowledge, in which case it's not God's knowledge, right? Or God knows his own knowledge, in which case we have the problem of now his knowledge is changing, it's part of God, etc. Right? You understand? This is the tension pulling to both sides. Either God's knowledge is separate from him, in which case we don't understand how he knows at all. How can you even say he knows? Or it's one with him, in which case it's constantly changing, right? When I say it's one with him, I mean it's one with him like a human mind is one with us, right? That he actually has knowledge. He has a mind, in the sense that a human being has a mind, right? You have a person, you have their mind, which they use to know things. So either his mind is separate, in which case it's not clear how it can be his mind, or it's his mind like a human being has a mind, in which case I don't understand how he can be infinite, unchanging, and simple. Right? There's other issues with him having a mind like a human being too, because if you put God in the context of a system, if you say it's him and his mind, the way the Rambam puts it is that this is like saying there's many gods. Who says that God is the God? Maybe the mind is the God, right? Not just that, but God by definition is simple. So now you have two parts to a thing. So you must say that if I have God and his mind, if this is what I'm calling God has a part which is called a mind, or an aspect which is called a mind, then he must not really be God. There must be something higher than this which is really God, setting up the big philosophical no-no of an infinite regress, right? You create an infinite pattern. The higher thing which is before these lower things must really be God, but then how does that know? And then I have that thing has a knowledge, so there must be something higher than that. And you never actually reach, so to speak, the actual infinite and simple God. So these things are not solutions. The Rambam's solution, as codified in Jewish law, not just a philosophical conclusion, but in fact the Rambam's codified, this is the nature of God according to Judaism, according to the Rambam, is that his knowledge is absolutely one with him. Meaning to say that it is not a separate being, like a computer. It's not even a separate faculty, like a human being with their mind. It actually is just God himself. God's essence, God himself, is his knowledge. God's essence is his knowledge. It's a relationship of identity. He just is his knowledge. In fact, his knowledge, according to the Rambam, is just a different word for him, with the exact same referent. It refers to the exact same thing. God and his knowledge are really just two different words for the same thing, which is God. God just is his knowledge. And really, this solves all problems. His knowledge is not separate from him because he is his knowledge. On the other hand, we don't have the problem of his knowledge changing, because everything that he knows simply by being himself. Simply by being God is how he knows. Right?
So God is like a tautology, an infinite tautology.
Yes, yeah, in one sense, sure. That's one way of putting it. A tautology is a logical truism, right? A tautology is like A equals A. Is a tautology, right? So God and his knowledge are one. They're the same thing. So you have. So that's what the Rambam says. He says it with the following words that we just read, which we'll now understand, that he is the Yodea, the knower, right? He is the one who knows. He is the known, the thing that is known, the object of the knowledge, right? And he is the mind that knows it, all as one. These three things are absolutely one. We should note that when we say the object of the knowledge is one with God, we don't mean it in the sense that maybe Chassidus would say it. I don't want to confuse anything here too much, so I'm not going to go more into this. We don't mean the actual object is one with God. We don't mean the cup and God are absolutely one because he knows the cup, right? When we say the object of the knowledge, we mean the knowledge of this specific cup. Again, when we say the known, the thing that is known, that is absolutely one with God, we don't mean the object itself. We mean the understanding of the knowledge in God's, the understanding of the object in God's mind. So you have God, you have his knowledge of the cup, specifically this specific cup, and you have his mind, which is his ability to know this knowledge. And all three of them are exactly the same thing. They all just are God. And we can understand from this description why the Rambam says that really a mouth cannot speak this, an ear cannot hear it, and a mind cannot understand it. Because, obviously, this is very different than the way that a human being knows, right? We really are the exact opposite of God in a sense. What do I mean? In terms of our knowledge. What do I mean? God starts, I'm going to explain this for the rest of the class basically. God starts with a perfect knowledge and nothing adds to it. We start with a perfect ignorance and are constantly learning. What the Alter Rebbe is pointing out here, and I will explain this for the next, God willing, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, what the Alter Rebbe is saying here is that this difference is explained by the different natures of us and God. In other words, the way we are necessitates that we start in ignorance and gain knowledge. The way God is necessitates that he starts omniscient and gains nothing. Which again is the point of the Alter Rebbe here. Why are we bringing all this up? Because he hasn't changed, right? He knows, and there's no difference in his knowledge before the world is created and after the world is created. The universe makes no difference to his knowledge. That's what we're in the process of explaining. So how does it work with a human being? First of all, we should discuss, yeah.
See, I think that's easier to understand
Yeah.
than motive.
What do you mean?
In other words, I think it's possible to fathom
Yeah.
that, I mean, to the extent one can fathom infinity,
Mm-hmm.
but the idea that there's just some continuum, regardless of time,
Right.
we understand it, and space, and everything else. And there's that existence,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's a singularity and it's simple.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing we can do to affect it.
Right.
But we go to shul,
Right.
and we
Right.
pray, and
What,
we,
so,
and
yeah.
we get to motive.
Yeah. Yeah. In other words, why should we?
Why?
You're saying, how can God want anything if nothing other than him exists? Basically,
Right.
that is. I'll say some words on that in a few moments. So let me get there. I think in the right place, and we'll discuss it a little bit because I think you'll see. Because I think you'll see that what we're saying here is it's a little bit more complicated than how I just put it. In other words, the lack of existence of the universe is more of a paradox than I'm letting on, right? In other words, the universe does exist. The question is, what is the nature of that existence? And the nature of that existence is totally nullified to this being who is, as you put it, a singularity, who is unchanging. So the universe does exist, right? Let me get to the metaphor for this, and then we'll discuss it a little more, God willing. I just want to, before that, we have to talk about the way a human being knows. We have to make clear that in a human being, the knower, the individual, their mind, and what they know specifically on any specific topic are three different things, right? Although it may be kind of intuitive, right? You have a human being. A human being is not their mind, for several reasons. For several ways we can see this is true. First of all, a human being exists before they have a mind or a fully developed mind, right? Quite possibly. A human being could exist after they have a mind. A person could, God forbid, lose all of their mental faculties and yet still exist as a human being, right? As an individual, as a soul. The soul is not synonymous with mind in a human being. So there's a human being, and then there's their capacity to know. The capacity to know, in turn, exists separate from individual knowledge of any particular thing, right? In other words, I have an ability to know. My ability to know really precedes or is separate from any individual actual knowledge of the cup, or if it makes it easier for you, 2 + 2 = 4, or the Pythagorean theorem, you can pick your thing to know. So the in other words, there was a time in everyone's life, I won't mention that, that's too confusing. There's a time in everyone's life where they don't know the Pythagorean theorem. Afterwards, there's a time when they do know the Pythagorean theorem. Our knowledge changes, right? What we're trying to get at is, why does it change? But first we have to point out the obvious fact, right? The very intuitive fact that it changes. It changes. We have a human being which is one being. There is a mind, which is something additional to the human being, and there is the knowledge acquired by the mind, which is something additional to the mind, right? So you really have a three part being, right?
And it physically changes the mind as well. It physically changes the brain.
Physically changes the brain, correct. So you really have a three part, going from the most inner, right? If you go from self to other, right? There's self, which is basically totally self-contained. There is a mind, which is a capacity to relate to something outside of myself, fundamentally, is what a mind is. Even my self-conception, if you want to get really modern philosophy, if you want to get really like the German philosophers, right? Even my self-conception, according to my mind, is not the same self as the self itself, right? If anyone followed that. In other words, even when I think about myself, it's not the same self that is actually doing the thinking, right? There's a difference between I, just as I am myself, and myself in my self-conception, right? Even that, so the mind is fundamentally directed towards knowing things other than myself, right? Is basically the point I'm trying to make. And then you have the thing which I am knowing, which is really totally separate from me, right? So it's kind of like a bridge almost, right? A bridge between two separate realities. There's me, there's a reality outside of myself, and we're bridged by the mind. The mind knows I know something other than myself.
So that's the difference between knowledge and perception.
Between knowledge and perception, why?
Because we think we know things based on our perception of what we think.
Yeah. We think we know things based on our perception of what we think.
Yeah,
right.
it's not true.
It's complicated. It's complicated. I see what you're saying. In Chassidus, what we think is really a direct faculty and an emanation of the soul. So it's not the perception of what we think is really in other words, to distance ourselves from what we think. I'm not sure really holds in what the Alter Rebbe's understanding of how the soul works is. But let's distinguish between the human being and God now. So the human being is complex. You have the person, their mind, which allows them to know something, and the knowledge of the thing that the mind gains. God, on the other hand, is an absolute unity and absolute simplicity, right? So there is no God and his mind, which lets him know separate things, and the thing other than himself that he gains knowledge of, right? That simply doesn't exist in God's case.
Texture says that God has no form.
That's also true. That's also true. You're right. If he had a mind, you could say he had some kind of form in relationship with his mind. That's correct. So really, if you think about it this way, there's really two reasons why we don't understand the way that God's mind is, right? There's two reasons. The first reason is that his mind is totally unlike ours. Right? His mind has no limitations that our mind has. In other words, let's think of it this way. Pardon me.
Who got excommunicated for assigning human traits to Hashem? Was it Rambam, or was it somebody got excommunicated?
I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Or got threatened with excommunication?
I'm not sure. It could be Spinoza.
It's in Book 1 of Tanya.
It's in Tanya.
He's referred to because it's a footnote in Book 1 of Tanya where it says that he assigned, the traits to God and they was threatened with excommunication because God's not human, he doesn't have these traits. He says, I'm just trying to put it in human terms. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Very possibly. I'm not sure. Who.
But the same thing, though, saying God has a mind is really just a way for humans to relate to a concept they don't understand.
You could argue that the entire idea of God knowing anything is an imposition, yes, but the problem is, at least in Judaism, is that we do have the idea that God knows, right? God does know.
But he doesn't have
The question is, what's the nature of that knowledge, right? That's the whole question. You could, theoretically, if you were operating from no system whatsoever, although I think it would also be quite philosophically difficult, at least like from the Rambam's perspective, for example, you could argue that God knowing anything is just an imposition. Why does he have to know? You could say that. I don't think it would really work ultimately. I don't think that's really workable, even under the philosophical understanding of God. I don't think it's workable. But in Judaism and Yiddishkeit, it's certainly not workable. Right, because we know that God knows. God says in the Torah that he knows.
He's got to have a perception.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure there's a distinction in what we're talking about, and distinction between a perception and a knowledge.
It goes back to what you said. God is knowledge.
So let's put it this way: because we are separate from our minds. Right? Because there is me, my mind, and my mind's understanding of 2 + 2 = 4. Right? That means that I have to encounter 2 + 2 = 4 in order to learn it. Right? In other words, my mind does not natively have the idea of 2 + 2 = 4 or whatever it is, right? The Pythagorean theorem, whatever you want, right? My mind does not natively have this information. My mind acquires this information by encountering it, by learning it. There's a process of learning. Why is this process of learning possible? Fundamentally because my mind is limited. In other words, because my mind and 2 + 2 = 4 are not the same thing and don't exist as any kind of unity, therefore there is a process or an act whereby my mind acquires this information. There is something new to learn, right? The Rambam's description of God's knowledge is that he totally lacks the limitations that our mind has. He does not have a mind which is confined to a certain area, and then the mind can grow and move elsewhere, so to speak, in its knowledge by acquiring new information, right? God's mind has no limitations. It is the same thing as his being. Therefore, there is nothing new for the mind to acquire, right? There is nothing new. There is nothing to encounter for which it can learn. His mind, in other words, as the Rambam says elsewhere in the Guide for the Perplexed, this description of God, that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, is really a description that's called in Hebrew shlili, which is the opposite of chiyuvi. There's shlili and chiyuvi, which means knowledge through negation, negative theology, as it's called in English, or chiyuvi is positive theology. This is negative theology. In other words, the Rambam is saying God has knowledge. His knowledge, he knows things like we know things. What's the difference between God and us is that all of the limitations in our knowledge do not apply to God. In us, our knowledge is limited because we have us and our knowledge and the things that our knowledge learns. And all of these three things are separate because they're each limited, right? They're each in their own tchum. They each have their own place, their own border, right? There's myself. Myself is defined as a particular thing, which is not a mind. A mind is a different thing, which has its own definition. And then there's all of the things that my mind learns, which all of them each have their own individual different geder, their different definition, a different nature, a different teichen, content, right? They're all different. 2 + 2 = 4 is different than the Pythagorean theorem.
3 different realms, completely.
It's literally three different beings. In God, It's three different essences, you would say, three different natures. Myself, my mind, and the things that my mind learns, right? In God, he doesn't have limitations, which means what, according to the Rambam? It means that his self is unlimited, his mind is unlimited, and the things that he knows, in other words, his knowledge of things external to him, is also unlimited. All three of these things are in fact the same thing, because there's not room for two infinite things, right? It doesn't make any sense. There's all three of these things are really the same thing. He is the knower, the knowledge, and the known. Or a fancier way of putting it is that he knows everything by knowing himself, which doesn't really tell you anything, right? No description of this state really tells you anything, right? It's actually impossible to understand. He knows everything that exists, but not by knowing those things that exist. He knows them by knowing himself.
In a sense, then he's bored.
His knowledge is perfect.
Bored.
Bored
He
also.
knows everything, so what else is there for him to do?
It's
He's just sitting around and playing with us. Creates worlds, but
You're giving a
Boredom.
lot of
The
human...
Rambam would tell you that to ascribe infinite knowledge to him, but to still ascribe to him the limitations that give rise to boredom, is to only go halfway through with the idea, right? If you really finished the idea and understood what you were saying, you would realize, what's boredom? Boredom is a limitation, right? I have certain capacities that aren't fulfilled. I have certain things that I could do that I'm not doing, or that I want to do but I'm not, right? And if God is truly infinite and truly perfect, he doesn't have any of those limitations. So his perfect knowledge does not come with attendant boredom. Boredom that comes with knowledge.
Why did he create us?
What?
Why did he create us?
Who knows? But that's not the discussion here. Der B'tachtonim is a different way to say who knows. Another way to say who knows.
Well,
The
maybe there's, in the hierarchy of things, there's an ultimate. And the one just before the ultimate is the penultimate.
Right.
Okay. And so maybe we just have to see ourselves as, we're pretty low on the totem pole.
Pretty low. The lowest of the lowest.
Lowest of the lowest. But they're sort of levels of penultimateness. Right?
There's actually, the way we're putting it now is actually there is no level. There are no levels of closeness. There's no approaching it, right? God is at an infinite remove from everything, and everything is equally low before him. Is actually what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say, right? That's kula kamei kalei chashiv. Everything is before him as nothing. Means literally everything is equally nothing before him. So that's actually not what we're saying. The Alter Rebbe, anyway, is trying to make the point that God is at such an infinite remove that there is no closer or further, so to speak. The whole notion makes no sense. Closer and further, right?
But then it does.
It does because of the tzimtzum, but the tzimtzum is like a pshuta, which we'll get to later. Tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is like a pshuta. It's non-literal.
You said lack of truth. Is that what you said?
What?
You said the Simpson has
Is
lack
like pshute, which means it's not taken literally. We'll discuss all of that later. Let's try and focus here for the last 10 minutes. His knowledge is perfect. So we don't understand him. We don't understand the way he knows in two senses. Number one, his knowledge has none of the limitations of our knowledge. He somehow knows perfectly just by being, which we cannot relate to, fundamentally, is what the Rambam says. There is a second, and in a sense, a deeper and the more emphasized reason we can't understand his knowledge here, which is that his knowledge is unified with him. Right? In other words, we can't understand his knowledge because it's truly infinitely removed from ours. We also can't understand his knowledge because his knowledge is him, and we can't understand him. Right? There's really two reasons we don't understand his knowledge. We don't understand it as knowledge, and we don't understand it as what it really is, as the Rambam saying, which is God himself. And just as we cannot understand God himself, we cannot understand his knowledge, because the two are really one. They're the same thing. So let's read just a little further, and then I'll tell you the incredible and famous metaphor that Rabbi Yoel uses to explain this idea. So let's read just a little further. Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm 2 lines up from the bottom of 919. Ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, Mehusay va'atzmusay, His very essence and being, V'daitai, and His knowledge, Hakol echad mamish mikol tzad upina. It is all one, literally, from every direction and every angle. Bekol derech yichud, in every manner of unity. I believe this is still a quote from the Rambam, if I'm not mistaken. The ein daitay navar davar nusaf al mahusay. His knowledge is not additional to his essence, v'atzmusay, or to his being. Kamei shehu benefesh adam, as it is in a human being, as in a human soul. Shadaitay davar nusaf al mahusay, whose knowledge is additional to his essence, right? As we just discussed. Umurkav ba, and is compounded with it. The human being is complex. He is a human being plus their knowledge. God is not God plus his knowledge, it's just God. When a man studies something and knows it, he already has a soul, a mind, before he learns it and knows it. After he learns, this knowledge adds to his soul. It adds to his mind. It adds to his knowledge. I now know a thing that I didn't know before. So too, day after day, as the verse says, days speak, and a multitude of days teach wisdom. Right? A person goes on in their life, they're always growing in knowledge, hopefully. This is not a simple unity. In other words, it is not just one thing. It's a murkav. It is a complex composition. It is a bunch of things added together, tied together, united together. There's the person, their mind, and the things that they learn throughout their life. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as opposed to God, who achdus pashut, is a simple unity, bli shum harkava v'tzad ribui klal, without any composition or any aspect of multiplicity. Right? There's no multiplicity, there's no division, there's no different aspects to God. The imkain, and if so, al korchach, we must say, mahusay v'atzmusay v'daitay akol davar echad mamish. His essence and being and knowledge are all one thing, literally, bli shum harkava, without any composition, without any complexity. All of this that he's saying inside is what we've just said in our discussion. There shouldn't be anything that sounds extraneous or too new here. Lefichach, therefore, Kashem she'iyefshar, second line of 921. Kashem she'iyefshar, just as it is impossible, l'shum nivra, for any creation ba'olam in the world, l'hasig mahus haberi v'atzmusay, to understand God and His essence, kach iyefshar l'hasig mahus daitay, so too it is impossible to understand the essence of His knowledge. Yeah, you can know, you just as you cannot know God, you cannot understand God Himself, so too you cannot understand His knowledge, because He and His knowledge are absolutely one. What does Rabbi Yoel use? What's Rabbi Yoel's famous metaphor to describe the God's knowledge, as the Rambam puts it, right? Which is, again, a perfect knowledge by knowing Himself simply by being. And we know it b'derech shalila. We know it with negative theology. He lacks all of our ignorance, right? In the Rambam's description, he lacks our limitations in our knowledge. His knowledge is infinite. The things he knows are infinite, and he himself is infinite, and they are all the same thing. How does Rabbi Yoel describe this? There's a famous metaphor of his, I believe original to him. I'm not positive, but I think this is his metaphor. A human being has the power to throw a football 100 yards, right? Let's say. The human being comes back to practice the next day, and he manages to throw the football 101 yards. We say that his ability to throw the football has grown. Yes? In other words, to put it more technically and more philosophically, we measure the power of his ability to throw by the result, right, which can be quantified, right? If he is able to throw 101 yards today, that must mean he has more power, all else being equal. He has more power to throw the football today than he did yesterday. We judge his power to throw the football by the results, and if you quantify it by dividing it into yards, right, you can come up with how much power this person has. You say his arm has 100 yards in it, right? You would even say colloquially, right? That's the capacity he has to throw, right? Now Rabbi Yoel gives a strange comparison. What if the person he's come to practice and he always plays from the same side of the field, and his whole life, all he does is he throws the football north. He doesn't throw it south, right? All he does is he throws it north. One day he comes to practice, he throws it north 100 yards. One day he comes to practice and he throws it south 100 yards, right? Do we say that his power to throw the football has increased? We say no. His power to throw the football hasn't increased. It's simply that he's throwing it in a different direction. What does that mean philosophically? What is that? Why is it? Why is it that when he throws it in a new direction, it makes no difference to his power to throw, whereas when he throws it a yard further, it makes a difference? The answer is because throwing, right, the power of a throw is defined by distance, right? But the ability to throw in a certain direction is inherent to the act of throwing itself. Again, inherent to the ability to throw is the ability to throw in any direction, right? Throwing as a concept exists in all directions equally. You would say in Hebrew, it's not mugdar in the direction. It's not, how would you translate? It's not defined or limited by the direction of the throw. The limit implicit in throwing, right? When you have more power, you can throw further. Less power, you can throw less far. That's how you measure the power of a throw. That's how you measure the quality of a throw. The ability to throw in any direction makes no difference to the power to throw whatsoever, which is a different way of saying that you inherently have, by being able to throw, you can inherently throw in any direction, right?
Not dependent on the direction.
It's not dependent on the direction. Throwing, the power to throw is above the division or the qualification of direction. Yes? Which is a different way of saying, the way to put it differently, is that the ability to throw a certain distance actually exists in my arm, right? Remember that language. He has 100 yards in his arm. He has the ability, I actually have the ability, and it is a quantified ability, right? In other words, if it's 101, I can say the ability grows, right? It's an ability to throw a certain distance that actually exists in my arm. The ability to throw north or south, or east or west, or up or down, does not actually exist in my arm. I don't have in my arm an ability to throw east. I have in my arm an ability to throw a certain distance. The fact that it may be east does not actually pertain to my ability to throw at all, right? It doesn't pertain. It's not actually there, right? Implicit in my ability to throw, which is not defined by any direction, implicit in that ability is the ability to throw north, south, east, west, up, down. Right? To the extent that Rabbi Yoel says,
you need to take up down out of that.
well, up, down is part of that. I want to include all six Torah directions as they're described. To the extent that, as Rabbi Yoel puts it, if God tomorrow created a seventh dimension, right, or a fourth dimension in space, right, depending how you number the dimensions. In Torah, it's 6, right? Up, down, east, west, north, south, right? Or you could say 3, which just defines it by axis instead of the poles, right? We mentioned this recently, right? If God were to create a fourth dimension in space, you would be able to throw the football in that dimension, right? Without adding anything to your ability to throw. It doesn't add to my ability to throw, to be able to throw it in a new dimension that God creates today, right? Why? Because throwing is not limited or defined by direction, as we just said. The power to throw that's in my arm has nothing to do with dimension. It's above dimension, right? So if God were to create a new dimension, I would be able to throw in it immediately. So too it is with our knowledge. That's Rabbi Yoel's metaphor. So too it is with our knowledge. It says in Mer Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, that as I said before, that God's qualities, when we say God has knowledge, really it's any of his qualities. He has knowledge, he has will, he has kindness, right? Any of God's qualities. We define them all in a way of shlili, by negation, negative theology. We don't say that he has knowledge, because as we said before, he doesn't have anything, right? He just is God. It simply in the act of being God, he has knowledge. So he doesn't have knowledge the way we have knowledge, that I am a person and I have knowledge additional to me. God is his knowledge, right? So he doesn't have knowledge. All we can really say about him is that he's not ignorant. Right? Do you understand the distinction? It's not that he has a capacity to know. A human being has a capacity to know. I'm a person. I have a mind which can know things. God doesn't have a capacity to know because God doesn't have any capacities. God is a complete, perfect, simple unity. There's no parts. There's no capacities. There's no aspects. So when we say he knows, what do we really mean? We mean he's totally lacking ignorance. Right? That's why it's negative theology. We negate from him all the limitations of our knowledge to the extent that we can't even say he has knowledge because there's no comparison between our knowledge and his knowledge. Right? You can't say that he knows like we know because he doesn't have a faculty of knowledge which we would recognize at all. All there is God. He doesn't have knowledge.
What you're saying is that he has God as supernal knowledge which we don't understand.
That's correct. But what are we saying about the nature of that knowledge? It just is him, right? That's what we're saying. It's not just that we don't understand it. He doesn't have a separate faculty. We understand that his knowledge...
We don't understand God's awareness.
We understand that his knowledge is not a separate faculty from him, but rather totally identical with his essence, with his being. Okay? Therefore, how does God know anything? How does God know anything? Not with a knowledge that's defined in terms of the thing that he knows, right? This is like the person who has the power in his arm to throw the football 100 yards, right? Because my power to throw is defined by distance, because distance is relevant to my ability to throw. Therefore, my ability to throw 100 yards one day is one ability, and then my ability to throw 101 yards means my power has grown. My ability to throw has grown, right? That's not God's abilities. That's not how God knows things, right? So too, I'm explaining this all backwards. Just as the human mind, right, knows something one day, and the next day it grows in its knowledge. Because the mind is defined by and can be added to by its knowledge, right? I have a mind. My mind knows 100 things today. Tomorrow it can know 101. It can grow. Just as today I can throw the football 100 yards. Tomorrow I may be able to throw it 101. My ability grows. God knows everything the same way that I can throw the football in every direction. That's how God knows everything. Right? If tomorrow there is a new dimension and I can throw the football in a new direction that I was never able to throw it before, it doesn't add anything in my ability to throw the football. It doesn't add anything to the power that is in my arm, because the power in my arm is a priori defined as something that doesn't change based on direction. The ability to throw, the initial definition of throwing is that I can throw in any direction. We say the exact same thing about God's knowledge. The way God knows, the definition of God's knowledge is that he a priori knows everything. Right? He knows everything by definition, which is why his knowledge is the opposite of our knowledge. In fact, the fact that they share a name is almost incidental. Right? What he is doing when he knows something is totally different than when we know something. When we know something, we have an actual capacity to know, like an ability to throw a football, which is then fulfilled or grows or changes or involved in the thing that we do. When God knows, we say he knows, b'derech shlili. We're negating human knowledge from him. We're saying he knows, but with none of the limitations of our knowledge. The same way as you can throw a football, right, in every possible direction. In every possible direction. The directions are all included in your ability to throw the football. You don't have a different ability to throw the football east, a different ability to throw the football west. You have an ability to throw the football, and by that ability, all of the directions, including directions that haven't been created yet, are all included in that capacity. So too in God's knowledge by definition of being one with him and being totally united with God, he knows everything by definition. He knows everything simply by being. And if tomorrow there was a new thing to know, not only would he know it, but his knowledge of it would not add to the knowledge that he had the day before, which is really the point that the Alter Rebbe is making here. The fact that something new exists, right? The universe does exist, Spencer. The universe exists in some capacity. The Alter Rebbe is not saying the universe doesn't exist. He's not saying it's non-existent to God. What is its existence? It's like a new dimension to my ability to throw the football, right? It adds nothing. It's all included a priori within his knowledge, right? That's Rabbi Yoel's metaphor. That's what Rabbi Yoel is trying to explain with the idea of throwing. He uses a rock, not a football. And he uses cubits and not yards. I'm adapting. But the idea is still the same. In other words, this is why the creation, right? The fact that yesterday, so to speak, there wasn't a universe, and today there is a universe, doesn't change his knowledge at all. Why not? Why not? That's why the Alter Rebbe brings up this whole passage from the Rambam here. To explain this idea. Why not? Why does his knowledge not change at all? Because anything new that's created, he already knew it. It was implicit in his knowledge before, right? It was implicit in his knowledge before. The fact that there is now a new dimension in which I can throw the football adds nothing to my ability to throw the football. It adds nothing, right? But just by being able to throw, I can automatically throw in every direction. You can have an infinite number of directions. I can still throw in all of them. That's just what it means to throw. So too God, it doesn't matter if there's no universe, there is a universe. His ability to know what's in the universe is totally unchanged. By being himself, he already knows everything, right? Which is not really possible to understand in a closer way or a deeper way, probably, than as we're describing it here. We're describing something that we cannot properly understand, but this is when we negate the limitations of God's knowledge, when we say his knowledge is truly infinite, that's really what we're saying. We're saying that the reason that God knows differently than a human being knows, the reason why he starts with perfect knowledge, whereas we start with perfect ignorance and gain knowledge, right, is not because he happens to know everything, right? If God happens to know everything, that means we're treating God's knowledge like a human knowledge, right? He doesn't happen to know everything. By definition of God's knowing, anything, right? Just like by definition of my ability to throw a football 2 inches, right? Doesn't matter how far I can throw it. By his ability to know anything, describing something which is purely godly knowledge, and therefore, his knowledge is perfect and unchanging. Really, what the Alter Rebbe is coming here to say, and I'll end with this because I know we're over, what the Alter Rebbe is really subtly adding here, the implicit chidush here, is that even if his knowledge is not identical with him exactly, even if there is something like an emanated knowledge, which is what Chassidus will go on to say, and we're going to explain in coming chapters of Tanya, even if there is something like an emanated knowledge, which is not his knowledge itself, even the fact that it's emanated would make no difference to everything that we've said now. In other words, the Alter Rebbe holds slightly differently than the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe holds that not everything that we call God's knowledge is identical with God, not necessarily. However, what the Rambam says about the knower, the knowledge, and the known being one is still true. And that's what we're going to discuss in future chapters of Tanya, that all of his, even if we say that the knowledge is not identical with him, even if we say it is like a separate faculty of sorts, an emanated faculty, even if we say that, everything that we're saying now will still be true, that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, and that his knowledge is not changed by the creation of the universe. In other words, even if you don't understand exactly what I'm saying, that just know that that's really the bigger chidush, the bigger innovation that the Alter Rebbe is saying here. As we mentioned last week as well, not just that God himself doesn't change, but his knowledge, even if his knowledge is separate from him in some way, his knowledge also doesn't change.
So
that's really what
even if it's separated, because it's not.
Sorry?
Why do you say even if it's separated? Why do you use that?
Because under the what?
You didn't mean to use it.
I did, because because the Chassidic conception is that there is something called the knowledge of God, which is separate from him to an extent. It's not identical with him, even though it's one with him. Right? There's different ways of being one with him, as we'll discuss. In other words, it's not really too bad. There's two ways of God knowing. One is by being, and one is through an emanated knowledge. There's a higher knowledge and a lower knowledge, as we'll discuss.
חוכמה הילה,